wisdom,
prudentia,
justice,
justitia,
temperance,
temperantia,
courage.
fortitudo.
Applying ancient philosophy to modern life, this is the Sunday Stoic.
On a recent episode, I asked listeners to think about their role models. Nicole wrote in to say, "One of my role models would be Yolanda, my son's preschool teacher, who passed away a week ago. She was humble and always put others first. She worked from 8 to 5 at a preschool and then 6 to 11 at a nursing home. She accepted the things that she couldn't control and improved the things that she could. I'm not religious, but she told everyone in a crisis the same thing. Trust in God, even if it doesn't make sense." And she said it with a great big smile. She died at age 45, and the big church could not hold all the people who paid their tribute to this humble, patient, hard-working woman. Wow, Nicole, I wish we could all have a Yolanda in our lives. And it sounds like she had quite an impact on your community, and thank you for sharing that. Today we'll be hearing from Mary, who's called into the show before and left us a voicemail. This time I got to talk to Mary for quite a while, and we're going to split the interview up into 2 episodes. Mary's father is another one of those individuals you might want to think about looking up to, someone to keep in the back of your mind. He was an Air Force pilot and later a Cessna test pilot. He loved flying so much that he built his own glider in the family garage. And throughout Mary's childhood, up until the age of 8, he shared with her wisdom that he gained, I'm sure, from his life as an officer in the military, but also from the Stoics and other philosophers that he was apparently quite familiar with. I think that Mary herself is someone that you'll be quite impressed with as well. Considering the career options and role models available to women in the 1960s, today's guest chose an unusual career path. Mary Miller is an engineer and owner of a consulting firm. At a time when most women became nurses and teachers or librarians, she knew that she was born to be an engineer. This was a horrific thought to her mom at the time. However, Mary retired from the Navy as a captain after serving 30 years as an engineering duty officer in the heavy industry arenas of shipyards, submarine and carrier overhauls, and nuclear power plants. Her dad, an engineer and Air Force fighter pilot, was apparently also a Stoic. This dawned on Mary in her high school Latin class as she translated Marcus Aurelius. As she read Marcus Aurelius's words, she could hear the same messages her dad had given her for as long as she could remember, and the term Stoic suddenly had meaning. Mary's father would notice her small childhood challenges and use those challenges as lessons to teach and mentor her. He would tell her stories of how he had made his own choices and chosen his actions, and gave her advice to how she may do the same. Mary thought that sharing how her dad taught her a responsible approach to mastering her choices, her character, and her emotions, letting her choose her battles carefully and take responsibility for mastering her craft while growing into adulthood, may be something that parents out there would be interested in hearing. Mary, thank you for joining the Sunday Stoic podcast today.
Oh, glad to be here.
Now, we've heard from you before. You left us a voicemail on the Google phone number, which unfortunately shuts off after 3 minutes. So we get short snippets of your story. But your father was an instrumental figure in your life. That's very clear from the little bit we've heard already. Before we talk about his influence on you, could you just tell us about him a little bit?
Oh, absolutely. He grew up knowing that he was born to fly, and he anything that he had to do to learn how to fly, to get to fly. He grew up very poor up in northern Minnesota. He went to school in Canada where they learned to play hockey before anything else. But up at the border, they traded off people. Canada people went to U.S. schools, vice versa, because it was, too far and too snowy. Anyway, he got scholarships to, I think, Michigan Institute of Mining Technology, now Michigan Tech, did everything he could to be ready to either build aircraft or fly them, and then found out the Air Force would pay him to learn to fly. So through that, he got his ticket into flying, and he ended up being a fabulous pilot. He ended up being a jet pilot, test pilot, and when he would recite his hours, when he had to say whether or not he could fly something, people would just stand around and their jaws would hit the floor. So he had this many hours in an F-100, that many hours in a whatever. So it was very cool. He's a fun guy. He built a sailplane in our garage. The negotiation with my mom was very much like the biblical negotiation of you can't build your sailplane if it's going to cost more than $5, etc. So he got it down to at $100. My mom said, "Okay, you can build your sailplane," and he had a sailplane built probably within 6 months, and he had it out there breaking records. It was wonderful.
So he could bring that Air Force experience into his sailplane building and make a wonderfully performing aircraft.
Absolutely. One of the lessons was I was educated as an engineer. He had, I think, 3 degrees: aeronautic engineering, electrical engineering, and mathematics. And he went through on a partial athletic scholarship and partial Air Force scholarship, from what I understand. But when he ordered his plans for his glider, I said, "Dad, how come, if you can design this thing for yourself, how come you'd order plans?" He said, "Well, it's within the $100 budget," which is number one. And number two, when a whole bunch of good engineers have built something and had it out there testing, then you bet I'm going to make some changes to those plans. But I'd rather have that whole team working for me than do it all myself and find out the hard way that I made a mistake.
Yeah, trial and error is costly when you're up in the sky.
Bingo. Yeah, and he taught me the humility of letting other people learn and learning from others, rather than just because you've got the credentials and the know-how, being a one-man band kind of thing.
Sure. So could you then tell us the dichotomy between your father and your mother? I get a sense that they had very different takes on life.
Oh my gosh, they got married and then they never got along, I guess. I was there. It was very interesting because Dad had an approach that said you thoughtfully look things over and learn from it, move on, pick your battles, and a lot of let's call it teamwork with people who are working with you. And Mom had more of a sense of there's one way to do it, it's my way, and if you don't agree with me, well, you've got a lot to learn and you're going to do it my way. And that can tend to mess your friendships up depending on who your friends are. So I grew up with looking at my mom and her friends and not wanting to be like that, and being scared that because I'm her daughter, oh my gosh, I might be like that. And looking at Dad, knowing that I was going to grow up to be a girl, but I wanted to do the stuff that my dad did and my dad's friends did. And when we'd go to soaring meets and he'd be up in a sailplane, I'd be hanging out with the different families, the wives and the kids of the sailplane guys. They'd all be up in the air trying to break each other's records. And I would always pack a great big cooler. Sometimes I'd have my sisters along. I had little sisters, so I had to watch them. And if I packed that cooler right, I could trade for anything with anybody. So we were welcome at, different picnic areas that different families had. And I really liked the wives and their families who, they loved going out to soaring meets. And when I went to work with Dad would take me to work when I was just little bitty, and I would sit like under or alongside the desk and play with drafting pencils and paper and stuff like that. And that was before you ever took kids to work. And I'm pretty sure, this was weekdays. This was before kindergartens. I'm pretty sure it was to get me out of the house so Mom could deal with a little sister or something. And probably because Mom was always upset trying to do too many things at once. And it may be because she just wasn't suitable for raising kids or whatever. But for myself, I looked at how I tried to figure children out and realized that unless I had a very good husband, I was not going to try to raise kids. So I ended up going the engineering track and military and things like that. So it worked out really, really well.
Your dad must have encountered the Stoics at some point in his college career or his upbringing. Maybe you don't know, but he apparently had read Marcus Aurelius and others. And
Yeah. I'll give you an example. When I was little, like before kindergarten, I could work puzzles. And so Dad turned reading into a puzzle because I wanted to learn to read. I'd see him reading a book. There's oh gosh, there were flight magazines, just a couple of flight magazines like the Kansas Soaring Association and the funny papers and the editorial section. And back then phonics had just come into vogue to teach kids to read. And so somehow Mom and Dad figured out, okay, let's teach you to read with phonics. And so you basically build a puzzle out of the letters and then you sound it out and you've got the word. Well, as soon as I could get through some words, Dad would come home from work and we'd sit down, or especially the Sunday funny papers, and I wouldn't just get reading lessons from the funny papers, but also the editorial section, and I would read an editorial and Dad would explain what was going on in the town or the country, and he would say, you can't believe everything you read. And some of the pictures, like Rube Goldberg devices were hilarious. He said some people work like this. They decide to make it more busy and complicated and think it's better when simple is usually better. You just want it as simple as you can get it so you make fewer mistakes. Don't get all fluffed up about how big or impressive your stuff is. You've got to see how it works. And simple sometimes is the very best. So taking that to, I was 4 years old and reading, and Mom's friends were all over me telling me, oh, you've got to grow up to be a nurse. You've got to grow up to be a teacher. And I would look at them and these were scary people and I was little. And these are like they had all kind of makeup on their face and they would lean down right into my face and, so aren't you cute? You're going to grow up to be a nurse. It terrified me that I would have that kind of requirement. I didn't know if I wanted to be a nurse. I wanted to fly jet fighters, or if I couldn't fly a jet fighter, I wanted to drive the garbage truck, and that horrified my mom, because why do you want to, and I knew why I wanted to drive the garbage truck. It's the biggest thing on the road. I could go anywhere I wanted, and everybody was happy to see me. We're done. That's it. That's what
a good
I want.
life.
Yeah. Okay. So where this goes is Mom was very, very upset at me that I wasn't deciding to be a teacher or a nurse. Dad, what he would do is, I remember this, he came home from work one day and Mom was beside herself that I wasn't giving up wanting to drive the garbage truck. And so Dad took me out on the back porch where Mom couldn't hear us. And he said, okay, you're just a little kid. Do you realize that? I was like, yeah, I'm a little kid. And he said, no, you gotta hear me. There's some really important people that lived a long time ago that figured this out. And he said Rufus was a name. And he said, Rufus means red, because I was Latin derivation or Greek or whatever. But he said, this guy named Rufus, he told people, and it was really important, it's important even today, that it's not as important what you do, it's who are you, what kind of a person are you. And so, Mary, I'll help you learn how to figure out what to do, but you're going to have to figure out and choose what kind of person you're going to be, because everybody on the planet will tell you what to do and who to be, but you're going to have to decide because you're the only person. Now, I took that to the bank, and he emphasized it because one time we were going he was getting a part for an electrical device or something on another part of Wichita that I'd never seen before, and there's this guy walking down the sidewalk the other way, and he had pictures all over his arms. He had these great pictures. And so I just pretty much stopped. And of course, Dad stopped, and I turned around and followed the guy. And he stopped, and he kneeled down, and I was just staring at his arms. He had big old Popeye type arms, And I said, he just looked at me. And of course, I look over, Dad's standing in the shade under an awning watching me. And he looked over at Dad, so everybody knew what was going on. And I said, you have pictures on your arms? And he said, yeah. And he flexed his muscles, and the anchor chain rolled back and forth, and then he rolled up his sleeve on the other side, and he had a ship with waves, and he flexed his muscles, and the ship went up and down. It's like, oh my gosh, I want pictures on my arms, right? and so, it turns out he was a sailor, and, Wichita, Kansas, who knows why, but so.
It's a bit of a landlocked location, but yeah.
Well, yeah, the coastal areas of Kansas. Anyway, when we got home, it was like the only thing in my mind was, I'm going to have pictures on my skin. I'm going to have, and he had a dancing girl, a hula girl, and he had a heart with Mom on it way up on his shoulder. It was really neat. But Mom went ballistic, yelling at Dad that my child will never have tattoos, blah, 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 And so Dad took me out on the back porch, and he said, okay, Mary, you're right. It's fun to have stuff on your painting on your arms, but I want you to think about this. Until you're 18, your mother's decision is going to require you to decide to pick your battles. And he had taught me how to pick my battles before, think about it before you get into a fight. And he said, this may be a battle that you don't want to pick, but here's the way it works, kiddo. When you become 18, you get to decide if you're going to get tattoos on your body. And he pulled up his sleeve. He said, now, I decided not to get any tattoos, but I could have. But if I would have gotten them before I was 18, my mom would have had fits. And I'll guarantee you, your mom will have fits if you go off and find out how to do a tattoo. But when you turn 18, the day you turn 18, even if I would tell you, no, not a good idea, if you decide to put a tattoo on you, then I will walk you into the doorway in the tattoo, and your mother won't have any say about it. And I said, but you wouldn't think it's the right thing? He said, well, no, I don't think it's really the right thing, but it's your skin when you're 18. And before then, you think it's your skin, but you need to choose the fight, pick your fight. And so it taught me that Dad would stand up for me, and that when I became 18, suddenly I owned my future. I owned my body. I owned everything. And before that, I could do something stupid, but Mom would be in a monster fight with me. And so I'd have to pick what was important and what wasn't.
So he instilled in you the idea of, in a way, some things are in your power and some things are not at this stage in life.
Right. Yeah.
And things have consequences.
Yes. And I know he talked about, at one point he talked about Marcus Aurelius. He said there was this emperor in Rome, and I remember Aurelius because aurum was a derivative of gold from Latin, because I was learning some Latin derivatives. And so Marcus Aurelius was an emperor, and he talked about Dad told me that he talked about you choose what you do in life, not just second by second, but the long view of, are you doing the right thing for your citizenship, for your, because I picked out the term citizen of the universe because I certainly wasn't a member of my family. I had no idea how I'd ever been born into that family. But as a citizen of the universe, I had a responsibility to the rest of the universe around me to do the right thing with my life. And that's the way you respect yourself, not what other people tell you. Not if they tell you, oh, you're a nurse, you're a great nurse. It doesn't matter. If you're not knowing that you were born to be a nurse and that's the contribution you're going to make to the universe, then you have no business doing what anybody else tells you. You have to do what you're born to do and the contribution you're going to make to the universe. And he said, Marcus Aurelius could have been born a slave, but his job was still to make the best contribution he could to the universe. And he wrote about it and he taught people about it. And so that's where I'd heard Marcus Aurelius. I'd heard Socrates, Aristotle, Socrates, and Rufus, and Marcus Aurelius. Mom and Dad had arguments that Dad was teaching me that I could take risks, and it wasn't in those words. But one time Dad came home from survival school. He was a jet pilot, so they all had to go to survival school. And he walked in, and he was still in uniform, right? And his uniform was all baggy. And it was a shocking thing. Dad didn't wear baggy uniforms. You're supposed to wear a uniform that fits you right. And he seemed skinny, right? And so I said, Dad, how come your uniform's all baggy? Why are you so skinny? And Mom said, oh, it's because he's been eating bugs. And Dad said, let me wash up. So he got cleaned up and got into civilian clothes and sat down. And so I went over and I would sit on the arm of the chair because I was little, and I would put my feet on whatever leg was closest to me, usually his right leg, and I would lean against his shoulder. And I said, Dad, why are you so skinny? Are you really eating bugs? And he said, well, survival school teaches you what happens when you fall behind enemy lines and you've got to stay alive. And he didn't really, I never learned what bugs he ate. I was really interested in what bugs he ate. But he changed the subject. He said, what's more important and what you need to learn, kiddo, is that the most important thing is that you keep your mind your own. And it's like, what? And he said, well, it's one thing to stay alive and evade capture, but it's another, if they capture you, they're going to try and brainwash you. What's brainwashing? That's where they repeat something over and over that isn't what you think until they wash your brain of what you think, and then you think what they told you to think. And I said, ooh, he said, yeah, and that's a lot of what survival school is, because your body can go through a whole lot. But if they get a hold of you and start working on your mind, you have to own your mind or else somebody else will. And I said, well, how do they wash your brain? And he said, well, it's more important that you learn how to not get your brain washed. Now, how do you not wash your brain? Okay, you repeat over and over again what you know you believe and who you know you are, because they'll tell you that you're not who you are, and they'll tell you that you don't know what you know. And so unless I repeat to myself what I know, and who I know who I am, then I'm in danger of getting my brain washed. And man, that stuck with me, because I think it stuck with him. I think he had just been through a pretty nasty survival school. And so I know that I spent a lot of time noticing when Mom would tell me what I thought, when that wasn't what I thought. Why was she trying to? And I would tell her, no, that's not what I thought. And then she would tell me, yes, that is what you think, and it's what you have to think, because blah, 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 right? And so I would think to myself, this is not good. I know what I think, and it was something. Remember, well, you may not remember. I remember when Wilt Chamberlain was playing for the Kansas basketball team. Dad and I would watch Wide World of Sports, and also the Jayhawker TV and the K-State. They would play basketball, and the one black guy was playing better than anybody, and that was Wilt Chamberlain. And Dad would always watch that, because that was one of his joys, was to black and white TV, right? We'd watch the basketball games on TV or watch Wide World of Sports on TV. And he taught me hockey that way and basketball. And sure enough, that black guy could play better than absolutely anybody else on the court, his team or the other team. And my mom came in and she said, what are you watching? And Dad had told me. I said, Wilt Chamberlain. And Mom got upset, because back then apparently it was okay to be racist. And Mom and Dad had a big old fight. Oh, it was very sad, but it was
Sure.
a big old fight. And at the end of it, Dad and I sat back down, and I was watching TV, but I was listening in some. And I said, Dad, do you think that black people are bad? And he said, no, I think there's some good and some bad people, no matter what color they are. There's some people that are good, and there's some people that are bad, and it doesn't matter what color they are. And I said, well, how come there's no black people at work? And he said, well, I don't know. But if that person, doesn't matter what color they are, if they could work well and they were smart enough to do the job, I would work with them. And this later went to, like, within I don't know, maybe that night, Dad, I want to fly a jet fighter. And if I can't fly a jet fighter, I don't know what I want to do, drive the garbage truck. And he said, well, Mary, I may never live to see the day when girls can fly a jet fighter. You might live to see the day when girls can fly a jet fighter. But if you're going to fly a fighter, you can do the same things that I did to prepare. I got good at math. I got good at aeronautical engineering. I got good at electrical engineering. And you know what else? You want to be an artist, and your mom's all upset about being an artist because she said you're going to be a starving artist. But here's the deal. Only the best 10 or 15 artists in the world ever make money. And since you know art, you're doing art all the time, because I was drawing and stuff like that. You have to think this through. Only you will know, can you be the best 10 or 15 in the world? Because the rest of them, if you look at what they do all day, and now he was going back into how what you do all day is who you are. If you're not the best 10 or 15, then you're not going to do your own art. You're going to do somebody else's art. And half the time you're going to be a businesswoman doing business back and forth, marketing, billing, invoicing, things like that. But if you work on what it takes to fly a fighter, you'll know engineering, you'll know electrical, you'll know math, and you'll know aeronautical. And I said, well, but Dad, there aren't any girl engineers. And he said, Mary, I hire engineers. And if a one-eyed, one-horned, flying purple people eater walked into my office saying they wanted a job, and if they were a good engineer, I would hire them. I said, why? He said, because there aren't enough good engineers. It doesn't matter what you look like if you're a good engineer. There will always be difficulty finding good engineers. And you know what else? You'll also make the money so that you can do your own art. And if you may be a great artist, and if you're that 10 or 15, you'll make a lot of money, but only after you're dead. Engineers make money right now. They make money paycheck, 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 and they may make more money than great artists. So you get good at your engineering, you might fly fighters, but if you work and master your craft, you'll come to love it, and that will be your art. Engineering can be your art, whether you fly fighters or not. And then that turned and moved toward, and if a person from China, or if a black person, or if a whatever, it doesn't matter who walked into Dad's office, he would hire them if they were a good engineer. And of course, Wilt Chamberlain wasn't an engineer, but it ended my question of whether or not I believed Mom or Dad on what you think of somebody based on what color they are.
So your dad seems like he was a very wise man.
Oh my gosh. And he talked to me at a level that I could understand.
And still remember years and years later. That's pretty amazing.
Well, part of it was because Mom threw Dad out when I was 8. And the whole issue of brainwashing, when I came home from kindergarten, I was furious because it's like, I told it, all they did was try to brainwash me all day long. They said I couldn't read. They said I was tired. They said I had to take a nap. They said I was done. They said, and so when Mom was going after me with brainwashing at night, every night, I would remind myself, just like survival school, what do I believe? Who am I? What makes me respect myself.
So,
And
so would you kind of recite or repeat in your mind the things your dad had told you then? You think that's how you were able to solidify them into your mind so well?
oh, absolutely. And I can still repeat stuff today that he told me that I bought into. If you master your craft, that will be your art, quote unquote. And
That's a
if
good
I
quote.
remember right, and I've read some of the Socrates and Aristotle. Well, darn it, I took Latin for 4 years, and I ended up translating a bunch of this. And as I would go through the translations, it's like, oh, that's what Dad was saying. That this is the guy, you know. So yeah, we got a bunch of Marcus Aurelius, Cicero, Latin versions of Aristotle and Socrates. I didn't like Greek, so I stuck with Latin.
I had a few years of Latin. I'm not as advanced as you, but yeah, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, well, it was painful until I started seeing the things that Dad was saying when we were sitting on the back porch. And then it's like, I've been transported. This is amazing. He must have learned it also.
I like the analogy you talk about your dad often taking you out to the porch so you two could talk. And as you know, the Stoa is a porch, the painted porch where the Stoicism started. So
Really? I'll be darned. Well, yeah, we would sit there, and I remember his knee, we'd both sit there with our knees, holding our knees, and his knees were level with my eyes. So I was little, like 3 when this started. And that was the only safe place to talk. And it's also where Dad could apparently figure out what I was ready to hear and what I could repeat. Because he said, okay, like one of the times, because I could tell he was so frustrated with me because I refused to tell Mom that I would not be an artist. Okay. And she kept pounding on me, tell me you're not going to be an artist. And to me, I thought this was wrong. And so I said, well, I might be an artist. I want to be an artist. You'll never make any money as an artist. I can't have my child starving, and so, and this would go on. And it's part of why Dad took me to work, I'm sure. But one of the times, Dad gave me a talking to. He said, look, you need to be thinking about what battles you pick. And and here I was, and I was looking at the top of his knees of his flight suit because he came home and Mom was all upset at me, and so Dad took me out. So the flight suit, his knees of his flight suit are even with my eyes. And, I'm sitting right beside him, and he said, you looked in the mirror. Do you realize when you look in the mirror, you're looking at a little kid? And I said, yeah, I'm a little kid. He said, okay, you're a little kid. You've only got 2 jobs. And he said, you got to promise me that you understand you only have 2 jobs. I said, okay. And he said, you got to promise me you'll do the first job before you do the second job. And I said, okay. And he said, can you promise me you'll do the first job before the second? I said, yes, sir. And he said, okay, your first job is to figure out what you love to do. That doesn't mean you have a label or you're not labeled as a cook, you're not labeled, but what do you like to do because you like to do it? Okay? And it doesn't matter what they call you, it's that you like to do it. Like, you like to knit, because I'd learned to knit. He said, you like to knit, right? Right. Now, if you love to knit, you're going to learn all the different knit and you'll knit all the time, but you just like to knit. You got to figure out what you love to do. Can you do that first? You promise me. I said, yes, sir. And he said, and you can change your mind over and over again. It's your decision what you love to do. Some people change their minds all the time what they love to do. He said, I love to fly. I was born to fly. And so here's your second job. After you finish your first job, figure out what you love to do. Find somebody to pay you for it. Yes, sir. And he said, because I love to fly. And I found the Air Force would pay me to learn to fly. They'd teach me to fly. And I don't need to go buy the boat, and I don't need to go buy the fancy stuff, and I don't need to go on fancy vacations because my vacation's at work every day and they pay me for it. And I come home, and the sailplane, that's what I do for fun, and it's still flying. And I said, okay. And he said, and remember, and this was calling back to this horrible fight Mom had when Dad got out of the Air Force. He said, and remember, I knew I was born to fly when I was little, and I still know I was born to fly. I love to fly. That's my craft. I've mastered my art. I've mastered my craft. That is my art, and I'm good at it. But you remember when the Air Force told me I wasn't going to fly and I was just going to fly a desk? That's when I got out. Cessna hired me to test their jets. And so I'm still flying, and they're still paying me for it.
Huh.
And what had happened was that was another porch conversation where Mom had just been really, really upset at him. And I asked him why he was making Mom mad, so he takes me out to the porch. And he said, "'Cause your mother wants me to be a general." I said, "Well, you'd be a good general." He said, "I probably would, but I was not born to be a general. I was born to fly." And so he pointed out that no matter what anybody, he told me, you have to do what you're born to do. And if you're miserable all day, you can't provide any value because you're living a miserable life.
So that ends part 1 of the interview with Mary. I'll release the rest of the conversation in a week or two. But before we end the show today, Mary called back and realized she hadn't finished one of her stories, so I'll attach her voicemail to the end here.
Well, howdy, Steve. This is Mary Miller. I never told you the ending of the tattoo situation. After Dad told me that he would take me to a tattoo place to get a tattoo when I was 18 if I wanted one, even though he didn't have one and he would advised against it, it would be my body when I was 18, my decision, and Mom couldn't do anything about it. Here's the rest of the story, because I don't know if it's stoicism, but by gosh, this is great parenting. He must have known I would be an engineer. He could probably see engineer written all over me. He said, "Well," I think it was 1962, "well, you've got a lot of years between now and when you're 18. And so I don't want you getting upset that you can't get a tattoo because you've got a big decision to make. Because did you know tattoos are permanent forever? And so whatever tattoo you get when you're 18, you're going to have it the rest of your life. And so you need to decide very carefully what kind of tattoo you're going to get. And so you may want a little one, you may want a big one, you may want one color, you may want another color. They may have different tattoos than what the guy had, like the ship with the waves and the anchor and the dancing girl. And so you're going to have to decide exactly what you want because you're never going to be able to change it. And then once you've decided, when you're 18, we'll go get your tattoo." You know what? I'm over 60. I have never decided what kind of tattoo I want. That is classic engineer. Anyway, he must have known. That's it. Bye.